We have a situation in New York, but also in the country, where like property ownership is more important to the functioning of our democracy than people's rights to live and stay in a home. And that to me is like the fundamental root cause of the housing crisis.
When you look at the racial wealth gap, that's not an accident. The racial wealth gap has been very intentionally designed by these policies, and I believe that tenant-centered policies inherently build power for Black and brown people, and they build power for all people, because when we're doing justice for the people who've experienced the worst, everybody else benefits.
Welcome to Rights This Way, a podcast from the New York Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of New York State. I'm Simon McCormick, senior staff writer at the NYCLU, and your host for this podcast, which is focused on the civil rights and liberties issues that impact New Yorkers most. Rental prices soared to record levels in New York City in 2023. Right now, a family would have to earn at least $140,000 a year just to be able to afford the city's median rent of $3,500. And this story goes well beyond New York City. Across the state, New Yorkers are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. 20% of New York State residents spend more than half of their income on rent. And in some ways, they're the lucky ones. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers are unhoused, with no clear path to obtaining permanent homes. Despite this dire situation, state leaders have not done nearly enough to tackle the problem. Nearly everyone agrees that New York is facing a severe housing crisis, but the question is what we should do about it. To help answer that question, I'm joined by three housing experts who will help us dig into this urgent and seemingly intractable issue. But first, I'd like to ask you to please rate, review, and subscribe to Rights This Way. It will help more people find this podcast. And now I'm joined by three guests. Julian Morales is the NYCLU's senior housing strategist. Cea Weaver is a campaign coordinator for the Housing Justice for All Coalition, and John Washington is an organizer and political educator with the People's Action Network. Before we get started, just a quick note that outside guests on this show do not represent the NYCLU, and their views are their own. Julian, I just want to start quickly with you to just kind of get like a quick sense of why the NYCLU is interested in housing policy. I think some people listening might not totally get the connection between civil rights and civil liberties and housing. And actually, we did do an episode in the first season of Rights This Way where Julian does lay this out. And I would definitely urge everyone to listen to that episode as well. Julian, can you kind of lay that out for us, please?
Sure. Yeah, I think, believe it or not, the New York Civil Liberties Union has a long history in engaging on housing issues, going back to the early 70s, specifically in regards to exclusionary zoning in Long Island, but also working with the national ACLU. But I think for us, housing is a civil right. And as you alluded to early on, we're in a severe housing crisis in the state of New York. Stable housing provides a foundation for employment, civic participation, health, education, children's well-being, and keeping families in their homes. It's good for families in their communities. And so I think, we think that stability is key in regards to housing. Without a home over your head, it's a little hard to navigate any other necessity for folks and their families.
Thank you for that. And now I'd like to turn to a broad question here. If you all could just kind of talk about some of the major housing issues that people are facing across the state. We touch on some of that in the intro, but in a little more depth, if we could just talk about the problems that you three are focusing on addressing. Julian, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. There are so many. I think that we live in a state where, I think we're pretty wealthy. Our budget is, I don't know what the exact number is, but I think it was like $230 billion with a B. Yet we have 92,000 New Yorkers who are homeless at any given night. We have over 175,000 New Yorkers facing eviction. And there's just not enough real deeply low-income or affordable housing in the state of New York. And I think, there is this conversation that's been happening, particularly since the start of last legislative session, on supply, which is a component. But, as I alluded to in the previous podcast, the market will not save us. We have been depending on the market for decades. And in fact, our housing crisis has gotten worse. The last thing I'll share is that I think that there were very successful housing programs that actually were created by government, which include, traditional public housing, the Mitchell-Lama program, and various other programs that actually were very effective in housing stability. And so I think we want to be part of changing the narrative in regards to some of the solutions for housing in the state of New York.
I think at the root of the housing crisis in New York, if you want to call it that, is actually a crisis of power and who is represented in our state and who our elected officials think about when they think about their constituents. Something that we like to prep our membership base around is that, for every one landlord or homeowner lobby visit, we need to make sure that we line up 10 to 20 tenants to go and do cleanup work, right? We have a situation in New York, but also in the country where property ownership is more important to the functioning of our democracy than people's rights to live and stay in a home. And that to me is at the fundamental root cause of the housing crisis. So in Housing Justice for All, what we're trying to do is bring together a force of tenants who can collectively assert their political power in Albany, at the ballot box, in their homes where they live, where they're maybe directly confronting the landlords who own their buildings. And we're pushing for public policies like good cause eviction, like rent control, like social housing, as Julian alluded to, that both take housing out of the marketplace, but also increase tenants' power to be represented politically, to collectively control a major asset of the New York economy. Something that a comrade of mine likes to say that I think is really apt here is that in New York State, real estate is like oil in Texas. It's the most powerful industry in the state. But the truth is that's produced a really powerful tenant movement as well. And so our housing policy really is the product of these two very organized forces fighting against each other in the terrain of Albany, but also in the terrain of the very neighborhoods in which we live. And I think, the crisis is bad, but we have achieved some really significant things. And I think we're going to continue to do so in the coming legislative session. I was really proud that in 2019, we strengthened and expanded rent stabilization to cover the whole state. Since 2019, cities in the Hudson Valley have actually opted into rent stabilization for the first time, stabilizing renters in those housing markets in the face of dramatic price gouging and dramatic gentrification. And now I'm happy to say that Rochester, Albany, Ithaca, and maybe some other cities as well in the Hudson Valley have launched efforts to bring their cities into rent stabilization as well. So when I think about the crisis and the potential solutions, I like to think about what are the policy things that we can fight for that actually are a real transfer of power to working class renters who, need to be represented. It's more than half the state, right? They need to be represented in our political system, which is dramatically biased towards homeowners and property owners.
Yeah, I agree with all of what Cea and Julian said. And I also just want to take it back and make it more personal. I live in Buffalo, New York. I think since I've lived here, I've moved about 30 times, had about 3 or 4 years of homelessness in different stints. And the reality for upstate New Yorkers is that these are some of the oldest built cities in the country. Buffalo has some of the oldest housing stock and therefore the most expensive and the hardest to live in if your landlord does not actually care. And so the reality for the human experience is everything starts with home. We're animals, we're products of our environment. And our housing system was designed to trap people to look like me, Black and brown folks in particular environments. And I think we have to really take it all the way back to what was this system designed to do? And there was a housing system that was kind of scattered before. And this particular housing system was designed to solve the problem of segregation, right? Of the fact that Black and brown people were moving north and coming into this country, and white people who are now white, but at that time were not considered white, needed to be segregated, and there needed to be a racial wealth gap and suburban, and all of these things are a reaction to the question of race and really class. And so I think it's important that we understand that this isn't a crisis, and the market isn't just influencing things. The market is defining our reality and taking tenants' rent and turning it into mortgage-backed securities and all kinds of things that allow and actually build the power. And I think that we need to be really grounded that the rent and the labor that we contribute to this economy is the only real thing in it. I think in 2008, 2020, we've seen just the likes that the federal government, that bankers will go to make sure that tenants are oppressed and that we are forced to give up our money to build their wealth. to build their buildings, to get their tax breaks. And so I think that the real crisis is like Cea said, it's a crisis of power, who is represented by this government, and also like what is the value that we get in exchange for our rent, because no one in Buffalo, New York is getting what they're actually paying for. I'm sure that that's also true across the state. And I think it's really important for us to be really grounded in just the human dignity. Like that's why it's a civil liberties issue, because how can you be free if you don't know where you're going to live, or if where you're living is killing you and making you sick? And 14208, where I live, like these houses are literally killing people. They're giving our kids, you know, all kinds of mental health issues, our schools, all kinds of issues. So I also just want to say this is bigger than housing. This is about how capitalism has made housing the insurance policy and the infrastructure of racial capitalism, and how we racialize the caste system that America was designed to be.
And John, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned as part of your answer there, which is the sort of racial justice aspects of the housing crisis, right? It doesn't impact every New Yorker equally. Can you talk about that? And feel free to bring in the national context as well, but just how a person's race can impact the likelihood that they are facing rent insecurity or homelessness.
I mean, if you look at the statistics on homelessness, you look at the statistics on evictions, look at the statistics on home ownership, and you look at like what actually happened in the 30s in the design of this economy and the insurance policies that allowed for this supply production that people like to talk about so much now. All of that was designed to privilege white people, to drive white people to move to suburbs, to segregate communities, and also to make sure that most people of color remain renters in terrible conditions and in conditions that were not stable enough for them to build the power and dignity that they needed in their workplaces and anywhere else in their lives. And so we talk about gentrification, but really that's just a name for powerful people, and powerful people defining the reality of poor people and segmenting in this caste system that also has our communities pit against each other. Because when people immigrate to new communities and are moving into places that have previously been segregated, it makes it really hard to build bonds and relationships when everybody's being treated subtly differently. And ultimately, I think most of us on this call don't like money, but money is power. And so the more rent we're paying and the less power and privilege people have to defend where they live through mortgages or through actual ownership of where they're at, the more then bankers and investors can bet on our rent and use our rent against us in order to build power, to build inflation. And so when you look at the racial wealth gap, that's not an accident. The racial wealth gap has been very intentionally designed by these policies. And I believe that tenant-centered policies inherently build power for Black and brown people, and they build power for all people, because when we're doing justice for the people who've experienced the worst, everybody else benefits.
I want to now turn to what happened and what also didn't happen last year, because I know a lot of what held up the budget last year was somewhat related to, it was bail, but it was also housing, right? Governor Hochul had various housing plans that were very much focused on like the supply side, on building more homes. And there was a conflict between her wanting to do that and lawmakers who wanted to do that, and lawmakers and other advocates who wanted to do things like good cause, but doing things that are more tenant focused that you all have mentioned that help build tenant power and aren't just about addressing a market supply demand sort of issue. So Julian, can I start with you to just kind of talk about what was accomplished last year and what's sort of still on the table?
Last year, the governor, I guess the plus was that she was really interested in housing. The downside was, as you alluded, it was essentially working with big real estate on major proposals for new development. It was also unclear like what affordability levels would be included in a lot of her proposals in particular. But with that said, I mean, I think there were many of us on this call and a lot of other folks pushing for a lot of things that we've been pushing for some time, including the Good Cause Eviction, the Housing Access Voucher Program, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, the Right to Counsel statewide legislation, and a slew of other tenant protections and rights that are necessary. And, I think through the budget in particular, it all sort of fell through with tremendous pushback from the governor's proposals, from a lot of lawmakers who felt like, she came out with these proposals and there was really no real trying to build and connect, even with the significant pushback she received from particular regions. But even at the end of session, when we have a supermajority in both houses in the state assembly and in the state senate, the leaders articulated that they were interested in a lot of different things, but they decided, since the governor was not interested, that they would not use their power. And I think that seemed to me to be a tremendous missed opportunity to, at the very least, have them show that they actually do support a lot of these issues and tenant protections that we're pushing for.
Yeah, see, Julian has alluded to this, that there is a supermajority, which means that the Assembly and the Senate could override the governor's veto of any legislation, right? Potentially, if they were able to get, all the Democratic legislators on board with something, or enough that they could override it with a 2/3 majority vote. But the way the legislature, as I recall, you should correct me if I'm wrong, but the way the legislature sort of framed it is, the governor, they're clashing, we can't come to an agreement here, but there isn't actually a need for an agreement if the legislature is willing to override this. And I feel like the governor even actually sort of hinted at that when she said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but at the end of the session, she said something like, the legislature can pass whatever bills they want, right? I can't stop them from doing this. So you can't necessarily pin this all on me. So see, I'm curious your take on all of that in addition to the first question I asked.
Yeah, I mean, what Julian shared is accurate. And to just add a little bit more sort of detail here, I think we are in a moment in history when there's a tremendous amount of sort of right-wing populist organizing happening in New York State and across the country. And there are a lot of people who are xenophobically fear-mongering about the role of immigrants in our society, for example, and alongside that, the role of renters, people who are maybe unstably housed, all the way up from people new New Yorkers who are coming to New York for the first time, homeless New Yorkers, and renters are being very associated by the right with things like fear-mongering about crime, even though that we know that New York is as safe as it's ever been, and they're fear-mongering about property values, even though we know that the real estate industry is doing just fine. And so that dynamic is in the background of everything that's happening in Albany. And so with that growing right-wing organizing that is happening in neighborhoods across the state, the real estate industry is capitalizing on that mood, sending mailers into communities in Southeast Queens, communities in Central Brooklyn, communities in Westchester County, the Hudson Valley, and they are fear-mongering about the New York State legislature is coming to seize your homes. You're going to lose that single-family home that you worked so hard to buy. You're going to lose all the equity. The government is once again coming to destroy your wealth. They are literally sending out mailer after mailer after mailer saying two things. One is that good cause is redlining, which it's not. It's not. Open up a freaking history book. Two, they're saying that good cause is going to cause an increase in crime. And they shape their message to the audience. And so in, Black homeownership neighborhoods, they talk about redlining. In suburban homeownership neighborhoods, they talk about crime. Either way, they are pitting tenants against homeowners in an incredibly effective way. And what that has done is that has created a crew of lawmakers in the state legislature, the Senate, and the Assembly who are a sort of right-wing group that is also organizing against the pandemic within the Democratic Party to block things like good cause from moving forward. So the truth is we don't have a veto-proof majority on this policy. And we have the thinnest of a majority. And so for us, we know, because when we go out and talk to people about good cause, we don't lie about what it does. We tell the truth. And we know that it has 86% support from Black New Yorkers. We know that it has 70% support in the marginal districts, those districts that swing Republican, Democrat. But the real estate industry has done a very good job scaring people by lying. And if you have a lot of money, you can lie a lot and nobody really cares. And so that's really set up. That's what happened, right? It's the governor doesn't want to do it. And the industry has whipped half of the legislature into a fervor over it. And so we are in a logjam, right? It's really polarized. I think that half of the state legislature Democratic conference would lie down in traffic for good cause. We have done a really good job building support for it. The other half would lie down in traffic before they would let it move forward. And so our job as organizers is to do the hard work in neighborhoods to say, like, this politics is not the game. The game is like talking to neighbors and having those neighbors talk to their elected officials and sort of taking the temperature down a little bit so that good policies can move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Cea. And John, I actually realize we should define what good cause is. Can you explain to listeners what good cause eviction is?
Yeah, I think it's best explained because we have no cause evictions right now, right? Evictions are part of the market, right? Like it's a product, right? So it's got to move. And if we don't have someone who's paying or we want somebody to pay more, we've got to move them out. But when I say we in this sense, I mean like landlords, obviously not me personally. So I think what good cause is really designed to do is to give a legal framework that actually allows tenants the ability to defend themselves in court. Because right now, if you go, especially in Buffalo housing court, if there is any question about whether or not you have paid your rent, no other cause or no other like relationship to the housing market in your experience is going to be heard. And so right now, to me, good cause eviction is actually a reaction to the fact that we have no cause evictions, that landlords can push anybody out whenever they want, however they want. And then we have a legal framework that makes that just absolutely too easy because there isn't this kind of right to renew or right to continue the negotiation and assume that if a tenant has paid their rent, has done all the things that they need to do, they really have no, they can just end the lease and terminate the lease. And I've seen landlords in Buffalo literally rewrite leases, lie about leases. I've literally seen them in the copy store across from the courtroom, like printing out a new fake lease just to tell someone that they've been evicted, even when this person actually has the original one that was signed. And so we need a legal framework that allows us to deal with that. And honestly, more legal defense for tenants across the state to be able to use it. And I want to bring that back to like what the housing market is designed to do and who it's for, because that is like the real question. Is that home for that person? Is that home for an investor and for the landlord? And I think that good cause allows, and it's something that's so essential upstate because our courts they're eviction mills, right, that are run by landlords. And this is like the first of many lines of defense that I think that we're going to need in order to combat this at a local level and also be able to build more power. Because right now it's really scary and really hard for people, especially in markets as small as Buffalo, where there just is not enough housing. The idea of fighting back against your landlord, about challenging them about the warranty of habitability and the conditions that people are living in, that can't happen unless there's actually a legal way for people to fight these battles. And I think that's what good cause does practically.
Got it. And Julian, can you give us a sense of some of like the details of what the good cause eviction bill that the NYCLU supports would do?
Sure, Simon. Good cause eviction is pretty straightforward. To be clear, I think like there's a narrative that like if good cause eviction passed, no one would ever be able to get evicted ever, and people would just stay in their home, which is completely inaccurate. So good cause eviction, in particular, like it pushes back on unjust evictions from landlords, whether it be that they want to raise the rent or they don't like the way you play your music. Evictions happen for many different reasons, and we just want to really define the terms of those evictions in particular. I think the other thing, and Cea, feel free to jump in, good cause eviction also does include a cap on rent increases, because in a place like New York City, there are a tremendous amount of protections. It's as good as it's going to get. I think outside of New York, of the New York City metro area, places like Western New York is sort of like the wild, wild west, right? And I think this is not the end all be all, to be clear, but this will give a tremendous protection to fight back against landlords who want to push people out, just for profit, but also particularly around rent increases. In particular, the last thing I'll share is that post the moratorium ending and sort of like the pandemic winding down to the extent that it did, folks saw rent increases that were just unmanageable. And so I think this will help balance that out a little bit.
And that makes sense. And see, if I could just ask, is there a particular percentage rent that you would be able to charge around an increase rather per year that would count as like a fair or reasonable?
Yeah, so I want to be like really clear about what the bill actually says too. It says that there is no prohibited rent increase. No rent increase would be prohibited under the bill. Under the bill, the landlord could raise the rent to whatever they want. If they fall behind on rent and they end up in court because of a non-payment case, the tenant falls behind on rent and ends up in court because of a non-payment case, which happens all over the place, the tenant could look back for a year and say, well, I'm behind in rent because my landlord raised the rent an unconscionable amount. And then the judge would say, well, how much did you raise the rent? Was it unconscionable? And this bill would provide guidelines for what is considered in that case to be conscionable or unconscionable. And that's why, like as John mentioned, we think that this bill really requires a strong statewide right to counsel program to be fully effective. What the bill says is that any rent increase that is 1.5 times inflation would be considered unconscionable. There are also other ways that landlords could get around that which, this year is about 8%. There's other ways the landlord could get around that. You need to put on a new roof, you can add the cost onto the tenant's rent. You need to fix the boiler, same thing applies. Your taxes go up, same things apply. So there's a lot of ways in which, if your costs legitimately go up, you can bring that to the judge and you can say, hey, judge, yeah, I did raise the rent, but I had to because I had to keep my property in good quality. So that's how good cause works in other states that have it, California, Oregon, New Jersey. It really just allows tenants to defend themselves in court. It allows for negotiation between landlords and renters. If my landlord is going to raise my rent $500, I can say, hey, I really can't afford that. I also think it's unconscionable. And it opens up the conversation in a way that right now the conversation is not open. Right now the conversation is, this is how much your rent's going to go up, and tough luck if you don't like it. And as John pointed out, housing quality is also very bad. So what's happening is people are being forced to leave poor quality housing into worse quality housing. If you call your landlord to try to get repairs, you get served with an eviction notice. There's a tremendous amount of retaliation. And so people are getting served with high rent increases. If they try to negotiate to stay in their homes, they get evicted. And then they end up sort of in a place that's both more expensive and in poorer shape. And that's true in a lot of the Western New York and upstate New York cities. And it's true in Queens too. So that's why we think that this bill is just so important. We think it's about leveling the playing field and opening up the opportunity for tenants and landlords to have a conversation with one another about what is going to keep the housing in high quality and safe and stable in the home.
Excellent. And thank you for that explanation. You highlight something there, Cea, that I know, John, you also touched on. John, can you talk about another prong of what you folk are pushing for, which is a right to counsel? Julian, I'll turn to you as well. I'd like to get your thoughts. But first, John, can you talk, as Cea was just alluding to the need for tenants to be able to have a lawyer when they're in housing court and facing possible eviction?
Absolutely. Also, want to say one thing I forgot to say is if anybody who's listening to this wants to talk about the relationship between redlining and our housing market and the lives of tenants, if you want to open a book, I would love to talk to you about it. I will give my number out, talk to you for hours about that, because I know most people aren't going to read, but I think the right to counsel is so important because housing market, judges, at least in Buffalo and a lot of upstate cities, are basically making what I call 4 o'clock courts. It's the whole goal of the court is to get as many cases as you can through every single day. And then, there's some nice legal services organizations that, will have a short conversation with folks before they go into their eviction hearings and basically walk them through their evictions, potentially negotiate for some extra time just so they can possibly find another place and not be homeless. But ultimately, if you have a law, you need lawyers, right? If you have a gun, you need bullets. And so I think that these two things have to work in parallel, because ultimately, if there is, if we have this legal framework, how do you use it? And I think that's particularly important because a lot of evictions also happen through intimidation and through retaliation. And so just the idea that every tenant knows that they have rights, and I always use the analogy of we all watch Law and Order, I could kill somebody and I get a lawyer. But if I couldn't pay my rent, or if I lived in a terrible place and I spent my rent money on heaters and canned milk because my fridge doesn't work because of electrical issues, then I don't get a lawyer. I get a conversation with a legal services agency, and I appreciate those agencies, but there's just no way that they can handle the capacity of these cases. And it's the more money is made in the housing market and the more advantageous the federal government makes it to be a landlord, the more these cases are going to happen and the harder life is going to be for the average person. And if you're living your life going to work every day, you don't have time to read housing policy and also show up to a court with a landlord and a judge and hearing officers who are all set up to help move you out. So I think it's incredibly important that these things work in parallel and that we actually have a full tenant bill of rights and ways for people to exercise those rights and also prevent the absolutely brutal retaliation because of the commodification of housing. Many of the landlords in Buffalo don't actually care about the conditions of their building. I've seen landlords literally, to get someone out, cut the heating systems and the pipes in the basements just to get people out because they're just planning to sell that home, right? And that's what commodification does, is it actually means that often landlords don't even have an interest in the condition of the property they own, which is, I think, is an assumption that a lot of people don't really understand, like how much that impacts people, especially with the conditions upstate. And so if we want to be able to effectively use good cause, and we want to get to the point where we can like collectively bargain as tenants, like we need lawyers and we need laws to work together.
Got it. And Julian, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd share that, like, at the root of the statewide right to counsel legislation, it's really about shifting the way the housing courts and the courts in general operate, right? I think that in New York City in particular, right, we have housing courts where any tenant throughout the 5 boroughs would go to a particular housing court, and there's a lot of different resources. But in other places, and especially outside of the city, sometimes there are judges that have like no expertise or experience on housing law, period. Sometimes they're not even lawyers, right? So I think it's sort of trying to ensure that, like, obviously folks stay in their homes, and in New York City, the law was passed. It's been quite effective. 84% of folks have been able to stay in their homes since the passage of that legislation in the city of New York and the 5 boroughs. But I think this brings some uniformity to ensuring that tenants are not just going to sort of like self-evict, for example, right? And courts and the judges would have to notify and verbally articulate that folks have this right, and their cases will not move forward until they're assigned an attorney. And it's not an attorney for 2 seconds where you talk to them before your case, which the governor has provided some funding for some sort of legal representation pilot program in Western New York, but it's not quite full legal representation throughout the process. And that's exactly what this legislation will do.
And Julian, there are like statistics around how effective and how important having a lawyer in court is, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, I think it might be 2020 or 2021. So since the Right to Counsel program, particularly in New York City, it was passed in 2017 and was fully implemented to be, accessible to anyone who's applicable, I believe, in 2021. And it's been quite effective in keeping folks in their homes, bringing down evictions. I will say that legal service providers are swamped with cases, and there's been, sort of a directive of how many cases is enough, quote unquote. I think that changes. In New York City, it's one thing, and in other municipalities, folks are seeing more or less cases, but it's been quite effective. I think the coalition was pushing this, is really thinking through about attorney capacity and creating a pipeline, and working with legal service providers and working with law schools to create pipelines to ensure that we have folks who know the stuff and can sort of push back on the landlord's attorneys and even the judges as necessary.
Right. And so, yeah, and I just want to underscore a point you're making here, which is that a right to counsel for anyone, a right to a lawyer to anyone who's facing eviction is important. But that right can't just exist on paper. It has to be funded, so that just because somebody says, yeah, you have a right to a lawyer, but we can't provide you one because the cases are too high and sorry, you're out of luck, even though technically we're supposed to provide you with one. So I want to move into a question about the supply-focused proposals that the governor has proposed. She wants to create 800,000 units over the next 10 years, and she basically frames the housing problem as one of supply. Too many people, not enough homes. John, I know you mentioned the fact that, say, in Buffalo, there aren't enough homes for people. And I would imagine that's true in New York City. But I'm just curious if you feel like there is a supply issue, but it's just not the whole issue. Obviously, we've been talking about a lot of non-supply side related issues. But I'm just curious if you think that's just a total red herring, or if that's a part of the issue, but not the whole part.
A few days ago, New York City released its housing vacancy survey, which is a survey that's done every few years by the Division of Housing, or the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, to sort of understand what's going on in the New York housing market. And it's a really tremendous resource that tells you all sorts of things about housing quality, about rent burden, about renter characteristics, landlord characteristics, etc. And what they found is that the stock of available apartments is the tightest it's ever been in 50 years. In the 50 years of the survey, it's the tightest it's ever been. There's a housing supply problem at the lowest income levels. Something like 80% of low income renters are rent burdened. People are living doubled and tripled up in places that they still can't afford. So there's like definitely a supply problem when it comes to sort of the lower end of the market. But there also is a supply problem with the higher end of the market. For apartments that rent over $2,400 a month to, affordable to middle class families, and middle class families need a place to live too, there's a supply crunch there too. It's the lowest vacancy rate it's been in years. And so I think it's without a doubt our housing policies have contributed to a supply problem. And I think that's really about tax policy that incentivizes market rate construction, that makes rental apartments too expensive to build. It's about single family zoning in the New York City suburbs. It's about the fact that New York City is a city of islands, basically. There's like not a lot of places to go. But yes, there's a supply problem. And I do think that tenant protections and housing supply go hand in hand.
Well, I just want to say, like, there's a supply problem the way that, like, my son has a video game problem. Like, the supply problem was created, right? Like, we eliminated public housing. Affordable housing essentially is a tax break that does not guarantee anybody more than, like a few years of affordability. And so the federal government and state, local governments have followed suit, have been on this like 40-year kick of like actually eliminating the supply of public housing, because when it comes to supply and demand, the goal of the housing market is to raise the price of housing, right? Also raise the amount of property taxes that communities are receiving. And so, yes, there is a supply problem, but that supply problem has been manufactured by the very people who keep saying there's a supply problem. And so if we continue to do this, and then also the supply is not even, right? As Cea said, there's a caste, the supply at the top and the impact of what that means and the choices you have. And so there's an assumption that lands so much in housing court that like people have a choice. It's like, oh, well, you chose to live here, so just choose to live somewhere else. And that's like the attitude of the courts and a lot of people in the system. And the reality is there is a very low supply for low-income folks. There is a low supply, especially in Buffalo, of like quality housing. And then there's 7,997 vacant properties that the city of Buffalo is holding. And there's been a public policy of the federal government and local governments holding back potential supply to drive the price up. And so like we have to really sit with like, what is money worth? The U.S. housing market is worth $35 trillion. That's enough for every American to live in a $400,000 home. And yet we have chosen to eliminate one supply in favor of another supply. And then we have vacant buildings because a building is an investment. And mortgage-backed securities and all of these other things mean that building $100 million buildings that are full of investors mean that like you don't actually need rent in order for that thing to be profitable. If over the next 10 years, the price is going to skyrocket because the people who could actually orient us to like a healthier relationship to supply keep saying we need some more supply and giving the supply to investors instead of people who need places to live.
And when you say investors there, John, you're talking about people, say, who have a home as an investment property. They might not even live there, but they're basically thinking of their home not as a place to live, or they're thinking of a apartment as something to invest in, not necessarily something to live in. Is that right?
I'm actually talking about real estate investment trusts. I'm talking about Steve Mnuchin, who took over our treasury and made the federal government a playground of subsidies for landlords and Wall Street investors. I'm talking about mortgage-backed securities. But if you are invested in the stock market, if you're invested in Blackstone and these huge corporations that have really kind of consumed all the property in America and around the world, there are so many ways that like a building can be used as a tool of investment and a tool of appreciation of value without any relationship to tenants. And then you also have the sub problem, like Cea was saying, of all these folks who come into Black and brown communities and are greenlining, right? We had this era of redlining and blockbusting where white people were moved out of communities because people said, oh, the Black people are coming in, so sell high and get out of here and we'll get you into these, again, federally backed mortgage supplied properties in the suburbs. Now the opposite's happening, where everybody's saying, move into these communities, take out these loans, take out these mortgages. Everybody needs to own a home and everybody needs to have an income property. So you have these two forces that are continuing with every single transaction to drive up the price of housing and also to organize more landlords and more people who are interested in being a part of a class of people that control other people's housing. And if you look at the state legislature, a lot of these folks are saying these things because they're actually landlords, because they benefit from these policies and the policies that the way that they are. And I think, I used to frame Donald Trump as the developer in chief, but like, I don't think we realize how much. It's very clear that like the oil industry and the military industrial complex have taken over politics. I don't think people are clear enough about how much the real estate world has taken over politics and how much the US government since 1934 has been about creating a racial wealth gap and producing white wealth and organizing people to be a landlord class against other people, because that is actually how our economy works. And if you look back to 2008, I keep saying it, you saw how much mortgages and the rents that pay those mortgages are really the only real thing in this economy. And so I think it's really important to name those things, that this isn't just like a crisis or a mistake, but right, this is an active machine that we are trying to like re-engineer to give everybody the value, right? Because if the housing market's worth $35 trillion, why are there homeless people? Why in the richest country in the history of the world are we not able to provide? And it's because we're providing to investors and not the people who actually need housing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the truth is that when we allow the market to be the thing that is driving development for the reasons that John has laid out really eloquently, the problem is that the real estate industry both isn't going to build in New York City unless they're making like really crazy luxury rents, but they're not going to build in Buffalo either or in Syracuse either, because they're going to be like, that place is divested and we're not going to build here unless we can speculate to get really crazy luxury rents. And so there's like a crisis of like sort of like land values where the market is just not going to produce anything other than luxury housing, no matter where, whether you're in like the central of gentrifying Brooklyn or if you're in, post-industrial Western New York. We end up facing the sort of same problems because the core of the problem is real estate speculation. We recently, last week or 2 weeks ago, introduced a new model for how you could do this, a social housing development authority that really is about having the state drive the production of housing, return to things like public housing or the Mitchell-Lama programs of the past, where you're building housing for very low-income people and working class people, public housing for everybody, controlled by renters, that can be counter-cyclical. It has just as much power to build in Brooklyn as it does to build in Syracuse or Buffalo or Utica. And we think that this idea is really exciting because it doesn't expect a private equity style return. I mean, John is talking about companies that are expecting 20%, 30% return on their real estate, right? That is not a normal return. Real estate should be something like a pension fund. You should expect like a 2% return or a 3% return. And that money can be reinvested back into the public sector, and we can expand high quality public sector housing. You could think about it like a giant land bank. A land bank is a tool that governments use to take blighted property, of course, they've made it blighted property, and bring it back into sort of productive use. What if a land bank's goal wasn't just to get buildings back onto the tax rolls and sell them to the highest bidder, but the land bank's goal was to buy distressed housing, to rehab it and upgrade it and keep it permanently affordable for residents and keep the equity that generates within the community? So we think it's a really exciting model introduced by Emily Gallagher in the state assembly and Cordell Clear in the state senate, and are excited to start campaigning for that over the next coming years. It's a bold idea, but it's a good one.
Excellent. Julian or John?
Yeah, so I work on the national level, and we're really working to eliminate the federal subsidies that ensure that there's always profit in the housing market and really drive them to tenants. There are a whole class of buildings where the federal government is financing the building. The landlord is not putting up their own money. Well, honestly, they don't even have to have really good credit. There are programs that are literally giving 0.5% interest loans for the first 5 years to landlords to purchase buildings. And it's also like, these people don't want to be landlords. There's just such a financial incentive. If I could buy a $20 million building and I don't have to pay anything and I can collect rent for 5 years, like, why wouldn't a business owner or investor do that? And so we really want to address on both sides the way that the federal government and federal funding dictates what the market looks like. And we are all being dictated to by the landlord class. And we want to ask the question, just for this one program, what would $150 billion look like in the hands of tenants around the country? Because right now we have tenants that are living in buildings that are paid for by the federal government, and they're not even using the maintenance budget, because the whole point is to buy a building basically for free and then sell it off and not really care what happens to the tenants. And so I think that, if we're going to have a robust social housing program, it's going to need money and it's going to need the resources to maintain it long term. And traditionally, the money in this housing system has come, from the federal government, and even at the state level and at the local level, it is still federal policy that dictates how that's used. So it's our goal to kind of rewrite those systems over time and to find tenants who are interested in owning and controlling their property and make sure that our federal government is giving them the same opportunity that they are giving landlords and real estate investment trusts.
And the last question I have for you all is just people who have listened to this episode who are convinced by your pitch to join the fight for the various pieces of legislation and policies. What can they do to help?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. I think for starters, you can start knocking on your neighbors' doors. I think that's probably step A in getting a sense of like what's happening in your building, in your neighborhood, on your block, in your borough, trying to get a sense of who are some of the local groups, civic groups, formal organizing groups, etc. And I will say too, I see a Swisher, shout out to the carpenters. I actually was a union carpenter, local 926 in Brooklyn, but there are many folks who are in organized labor to the extent that we can move labor to be more actively engaged. But also too, I think to what we alluded to earlier, I think, calling up your elected officials and putting the pressure on them. We have been doing targeted lobby days and are hoping actually to do a particular one dedicated on the Buffalo delegation in particular, pushing your electeds and making the case on why they should be supporting these bills and pushing back on any of the rhetoric around these are no good or these are not supporting other proposals. I think that's also at the heartbeat of what folks can, do immediately.
Yeah, if you go to our website, I couldn't agree more with what Julian shared. The best thing that you can do is talk to your neighbors. And if you need support in talking to your neighbors, you can reach out to us, info@housingjusticeforall.org. We'll hook you up with a tenant organizer in your neighborhood and talk you through the first steps that you need to build a community association or a tenant association where you live. If you don't want to organize a tenant association or a community association, there's still plenty that you can do to support the movement. If you go to our website, www.housingjusticeforall.org, you'll find a little fancy tool there that you can use to call your state representative and let them know that you support common sense tenant protections like good cause and like right to counsel. Our state representatives need to hear from you. They need to hear from their constituents about why housing stability is so important. If you're a homeowner and you support tenants' rights, you should call them and tell them that because your voice counts twice as much, and we need allies who are property owners. If you're a renter, call them and remind them that you matter, that you vote too, and that they should be passing policies that will help stabilize our whole neighborhoods. Renter protections are good for everybody. Nobody does well, homeowners don't do well when our neighborhoods face intense turnover, when our schools don't have stability in the classroom. And so these are public policies that are good for everyone, whether you rent or whether you own, and please do, get involved.
All right. And with that, John, Cea, Julian, thank you so much for coming on Rights This Way.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you for listening. You can find out more about everything we talked about today by visiting NYCLU.org. And you can follow us at NYCLU on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you have questions or comments about Rights This Way, you can email us at podcast@nyclu.org. Until next time, I'm Simon McCormack. Thank you for fighting for a fair New York.